Have you ever noticed how sometimes it's not our enemies who wound us the deepest, but the very people who should stand by our side? There's a kind of silent pain that no expensive gift can cover up. The pain of being forgotten by those we raised, taught, and loved. And that's exactly what happened to me. On Christmas Eve, the night when families everywhere gather together, I set the table, lit the candles, and waited. But what arrived wasn't my son. It was silence. The irony of life is that behind our greatest humiliation, we sometimes discover our greatest revelation. That night, which felt so hopeless, carried within it a secret powerful enough to change not just the course of a holiday, but the course of an entire life. And it all began with a small, forgotten gift left under the tree. I don't know if you've ever lived through this, but there's a loneliness that doesn't come from a quiet house. It comes from the emptiness people leave behind when they break a promise. That Christmas was exactly like that. I, George Anderson, 63 years old, had prepared the dinner with the kind of care only someone who grew up in a modest home could understand. Every dish on that table held not just food, but pieces of my own story. The golden turkey, the candles glowing, the wine breathing in the glass. Everything was ready for a celebration. But the main chair, the one meant for my son Daniel, remained empty. And it's incredible how one single absence can outweigh 10 presences. The Zavi lights on the porch twinkled happily, almost mocking me. Anyone walking down the street would have said, "What a beautiful party must be happening in there." Little did they know, there was no party at all. Just me and a stubborn hope refusing to die. You know what's funny? We always try to make excuses for the ones we love. I kept glancing at the clock, thinking, maybe he's stuck in traffic. Maybe his fiancée is taking longer to get ready. But as the minutes dragged on, reality pressed in like a cold blade. He wasn't coming. What was left was the betrayal disguised as indifference, the silent humiliation of a father left behind. People say dignity is tested in great battles, but that's not true. It's tested in these small, everyday gestures. The phone call that never comes, the "I promise Dad" that turns into silence, the forgotten manners that should have been the foundation of family respect. Ever notice how that hurts more than a direct insult? When a stranger offends us, we call it, an insult. But when family does it, we call it disappointment. And disappointment carries a wound no medicine can heal. It lingers, throbbing, reminding us that respect should never be a luxury. As I looked at that untouched table, a strange mix consumed me. Anger, sadness, and helplessness. I'd faced hardships before, but nothing compared to the pain of realizing that the one you gave everything to can't even give you the bare minimum in return. And that minimum was simply presence. It felt as though a lifetime of sacrifice, sleepless nights, bills paid with sweat, dreams postponed, had turned to dust in the face of one absence. The betrayal wasn't just the lack of a hug that night. It was the reminder that maybe my son no longer saw me as a priority. Do you know what kept me from blowing out the candles? A memory. It's strange how the mind works. Sometimes a single detail can pull us back from the edge. I remembered a Christmas long ago, when Daniel was just a little boy. He ran to me with his tiny hands and begged me to wait before starting dinner, because he wanted to hold my hand while we prayed. In that instant, even as the food cooled and loneliness crushed me, I realized that little boy still lived inside the man who had forgotten me. That memory gave me the strength to let the night go on. Life has a way of teaching us about revenge and about freedom. Many in my shoes would have blown out the candles, locked the door, and said, "Never again." I thought about it too, I won't lie. But deep down, I realized revenge didn't have to be my path. My true freedom was in refusing to let his absence decide the worth of my Christmas. So instead of surrendering to humiliation, I sat there, staring at the wavering candle flames, clinging to a quiet hope that the night still had something left to reveal. And that's when my eyes fell on the tree in the corner, glowing with old ornaments and colorful lights. Hidden among the branches was a small box I hadn't noticed before, carefully tucked away under the other presents. I had completely forgotten about it. And in that moment, it felt like life itself was whispering, "It's not over yet." That little box carried more weight than its size. It held not only a gift, but a piece of me. And though I didn't yet know what I would do with it, I felt that this night still had a surprise waiting to unfold. Do you know what cuts a father's heart the most? It's not hearing "I don't love you," because words like that are often said in anger. What truly destroys is seeing a promise broken. A promise is a silent pact, a word given, and a word is the essence of dignity. As I stared at that glowing tree, each flicker of light reminded me of a conversation from just weeks before. Daniel, with that rushed smile, had told me, "Dad, I'll spend Christmas with you. Olivia and I will be there." And I, foolish or hopeful, believed him. Isn't it strange how parents trust so easily? For us, a child's word means more than any signed contract. But reality always collects its debt. And in that moment, sitting alone by the tree, I knew Daniel had chosen differently. Instead of being with me, he had gone off with Olivia to some fancy party. One of those glittering nights where champagne flows like water, where appearances matter more than affection. The humiliation wasn't just his absence. It was what that absence meant. He chose the shallow glow of strangers over the warm embrace of his own father's home. That's the betrayal. That cuts the deepest. Not just not showing up, but choosing another stage, another crowd, another applause. And of course I asked myself, where did I go wrong? Had I failed to teach him that family comes before vanity? How many parents have asked themselves that same question? We look back at the times we gave up so much so our children could have more. Maybe you've skipped buying new clothes so you could pay for school. Maybe you stayed home instead of going out, just to cover the bills. And when, after all that, what comes back is indifference. The pain mixes with a kind of silent revenge. Not against them, but against ourselves, for believing it would be different. In that moment, as the clock ticked on mercilessly, I realized that broken promises don't just speak about the one who breaks them, they also speak about the one who receives them. They force us to look inward, to measure how far we'll allow that pain to dictate the direction of our lives. I could have blown out the candles, cleared the table, and decided never to expect anything from Daniel again. Many people do just that. They build walls, freeze their feelings, and choose to live without depending on anyone. It's a tempting path, because it shields you from the risk of humiliation. But at the same time, it's an invisible prison that robs us of our ability to feel. True freedom isn't about shutting down. It's about learning how to stay open, even after we've been hurt. And maybe that's why I couldn't simply end the night. Something inside me whispered, "It's not over yet." Have you ever felt that? When life seems to be pushing you toward an ending, but something keeps holding you in the scene? That's exactly how it was. Looking at the tree, with its lights blinking like they were mocking and comforting me at the same time, I noticed a detail I had forgotten, a small box tucked beneath the branches. In the rush of preparing everything, I had completely overlooked it. It wasn't just any package. It was a gift I had chosen for Daniel months earlier. The irony made me laugh bitterly. He had broken his promise to be with me, but here was the reminder of my promise, to keep being a father, to keep trying, to never give up. The gift was simple, nothing that would sparkle in Olivia's eyes or impress the crowd he surrounded himself with, but it carried deep meaning. I thought about throwing it away, I'll admit. Anger drives us toward reckless choices, and for a few seconds I pictured myself crushing the wrapping paper and ending it all there. But at the same time, a quiet voice inside told me no, that this object had a purpose greater than I could yet see. And this is where life shows its irony, because while I wrestled with the sting of a broken promise, fate set another choice in front of me. What to do with that forgotten gift? Ignoring it would mean accepting defeat. Stashing it away would mean freezing a memory with no purpose. But giving it, could change everything. I didn't know it yet, but that small box was a bridge between humiliation and the chance for redemption. Without realizing it, in that instant, I was already walking toward the next decision that would change our story. It's strange how life plays with the details we forget. There I sat, chewing on the pain of betrayal, staring at that small box hidden under the tree. I had bought it months earlier, back when hope still burned strong. The wrapping paper was a little wrinkled, but maybe that was what made it symbolic. It represented the time that had passed, but also the persistence of love. It wasn't an expensive gift, nothing fit for a glamorous party. It was simple, but it was full of meaning. And sometimes the simplest things become the most powerful reminders of who we really are. Have you noticed how the most valuable gifts are rarely the most expensive? Think about it. A handwritten letter, a book marked with personal notes, a family heirloom passed down through generations. Those are the real treasures. It's easy to buy something costly. It takes heart to choose something that speaks directly to the soul of the person receiving it. That's what I wanted for Daniel. Something that represented our history, our connection, our respect. But in the humiliation of that night, that gift suddenly felt like a symbol of my own naivety. I even thought, why keep this? He doesn't even care. But there's a thin line between revenge and freedom, and it runs right through the small choices we make in moments like this. I could have tossed the box in the trash, like throwing away a piece of my heart. I could have shoved it into a drawer, keeping it as a bitter reminder of a lonely Christmas. But instead, another idea came to me. Send the gift anyway, not as an act of submission, but as an act of dignity. Because deep deep down, a gift is never just about the one who receives. It's about the one who gives. And I refuse to let that night's betrayal rob me of my ability to give. It's funny how we think we're doing something for someone else, when in the end, we're doing it for ourselves. By choosing not to discard that box, I realized I was choosing to free myself from the prison of resentment. It wasn't about whether Daniel deserved it. It was about not letting pain define my character. How many times have you found yourself in that same place, where hurt told you, give up, but your heart whispered, keep going? Maybe in a strained marriage, when you still prepare breakfast after a fight, or in a wounded friendship, when you send a good morning message even with no reply. Those small gestures become seeds of freedom. Of course, it wasn't an easy decision. Anger circled me, whispering, what if he laughs at this? What if he despises you even more? But then I remembered something my mother used to say. Respect begins at home, and it begins with you respecting yourself. It hit me like a punch to the gut, because I realized that in giving that gift, I wasn't lowering myself. I was affirming my worth. I was showing that dignity cannot be negotiated. And dignity, you see, isn't empty pride. It isn't puffing your chest and declaring you're right. It's acting in line with what you believe, even when no one is clapping. So I made my choice. The box would be delivered, not by me personally. I knew the emotions were still too raw, but it would reach him somehow. Isn't it interesting how these moments test everything we've taught? Everything I had ever tried to instill in my son, about family, respect, responsibility, wasn't being tested in his actions. It was being tested in mine. I chose to live up to what I had always preached, even when he hadn't, because it's easy to teach with words, harder to teach with actions. And in some way, I realized that this gift could become more than just an object. It could become a silent lesson. As I held the box in my hands, I felt something shift. It wasn't just paper and ribbon. It was a piece of me, my story, my emotions, my sacrifices, the key, the symbol, what lay inside. It was all still hidden, waiting to be revealed. And in that moment, a sudden clarity washed over me. Maybe I wasn't just sending a gift. Maybe I was opening a path toward a story that wasn't finished. I didn't know how Daniel would react, whether with contempt or with surprise, but I was certain of one thing. That box carried a truth that, sooner or later, would come to light. And that's when the night took on a new meaning. The loneliness was still there. The sting of the broken promise still hurt, but something inside me had changed. I was no longer just the wounded father. I was the man who, in the face of humiliation, chose not to snuff out the flame of respect. I was the one who, even after betrayal, chose freedom over revenge. And in making that choice, I realized destiny was setting the stage for something greater. After all, when a forgotten gift is rediscovered, it is rarely by accident. It always carries within it a revelation that changes everything. The next morning, I woke up with that strange mix of courage and fear. The box was still sitting on the table, almost daring me to act. I looked at it the way you look at a mirror. It wasn't just a gift. It was a piece of me I needed to let go. After a night of wrestling with my thoughts, I decided I couldn't keep it for myself. Something inside me kept saying, go, deliver it. And so I did. I picked up the package, tucked it under my arm, and stepped outside. The chill of that December morning matched exactly what I carried in my heart. The sting of humiliation still fresh, and yet a small flame of dignity that pushed me forward. With every step toward my son's house, I rehearsed all the reasons to give up. He doesn't deserve it, I thought. He'll laugh at this, ignore it, toss it aside. But alongside those harsh voices, there was a softer, steady one reminding me, you're not doing this for him. You're doing it for you. Because respect starts within yourself. That voice gave me strength. I didn't knock, didn't want a scene, didn't want words. I simply placed the gift on the welcome mat, like leaving behind a secret on the verge of being discovered. Have you noticed how small gestures can turn into great lessons? Think of a teacher who, instead of punishing a restless student, chooses to believe in him. That single act can change an entire future. Or a friend who, even hurt, still texts you to make sure you got home safe. It's in those moments we understand life isn't about what we receive. It's about what we choose to give. Leaving that gift was exactly that. A simple gesture, but one loaded with emotion. Maybe it would be ignored, or maybe it would spark something deeper. As I walked back home, the icy wind brushed my face, as if sweeping away the last doubts I carried. And strangely, I felt free. I was no longer chained to the expectation of how my son would react. I had done my part. I had upheld my dignity, and that was something no one could take from me. How often in life do we trap ourselves waiting for acknowledgement? At work, in family, in friendships, we become prisoners of the thank you that never comes. That morning, I learned that the greatest revenge against ingratitude is refusing to let it change who you are. Hours later, I heard Daniel had opened the package. I wasn't there, but I could picture it. Him, surrounded by guests at his lavish party, tearing through the sacks, wrapping paper with that air of superiority. Maybe he expected something ordinary, maybe even chuckled at the simplicity of the package. But in that moment, before everyone, the surprise came. What was inside wasn't just an object. It was a fragment of history, a symbol of sacrifices he had never stopped to consider. And suddenly, that room full of shallow laughter turned into the stage for a revelation. I can't describe his exact expression, but I can imagine the impact. Symbolic gifts carry that kind of power. They don't shout, but they speak straight to the heart. Like when someone receives an old family watch or a letter written decades ago. It's not the material worth that matters. It's the weight of memory, the invisible thread that ties generations together. And in that instant, without realizing it, I had placed in my son's hands a key, not only in the literal sense, but as an opportunity, the chance to rethink his choices, his upbringing, the value of family, and the respect he'd been neglecting. And that's how the story began to shift. That simple act of leaving a box at the door turned into something far bigger than I could have imagined. It wasn't about the gift anymore. It was about what it awakened. Because in the end, life is made of those crossroads where betrayal meets revelation, where humiliation meets liberation. And even though I didn't know how Daniel would react from then on, I knew one thing. That night, the silence in my home no longer felt the same. It carried a new energy, as if sensing that something bigger was on the horizon. After all, the object inside that box still had much to say. When Daniel finally opened the gift, surrounded by friends and his fiancée, Olivia, I imagine he expected something trivial, maybe a tie, a pen, some cliché token from father to son. But what he found left him speechless. Inside the box, wrapped in an old cloth, was a rusted key. Not an ordinary key, it was large, heavy, the kind used decades ago to open safes or chests. Alongside it were several yellowed papers, carefully folded with age. The smirk he wore while ripping open the wrapping paper turned into heavy silence. It was as if that object had pierced the bubble of superficiality around that party. The people around him, used to flashy gifts, looked puzzled. Some whispered, others chuckled under their breath. What a strange present. But it was exactly in that contrast that the true weight appeared. Because the key, by itself, wasn't just an object. It was a riddle. It hinted at a secret, a story yet untold. The papers, though folded, showed the firm strokes of handwritten words, not printed text. And in a world used to quick text messages, that sight carried a nearly forgotten force. That's when the room, once noisy, seemed to hold its breath. Daniel gripped the key, confused, while Olivia, visibly irritated, whispered something in his ear. But the one who truly broke the silence was Catherine, my sister, Daniel's aunt, who was among, the guests. With just one look, she recognized it. "That key," she said, her voice trembling, "is to your father's safe." And in that instant, everything changed. What moments before seemed like a ridiculous, humiliating gift turned into a revelation. Have you ever noticed how a single object can carry entire generations inside it? A family ring, a faded photograph, an old letter. They all hold that power, reminding us we belong to something greater than our temporary ego. That's exactly what happened there. The key wasn't just metal, it was memory, sacrifice, dignity made tangible. And the papers that came with it weren't just documents. They were written proof of a lifetime dedicated to family, even when that very family sometimes turned its back. As Daniel tried to hide his confusion in front of the guests, I imagined that inside, something cracked. That key was more than he could brush off. It wasn't a luxury watch to flaunt, but something that forced him to confront his own conscience. How many times in life are we given gifts like that? Situations that seem small, but demand a choice, to laugh them off or to stop and reflect. Like when someone gives us simple but piercing advice, and we decide whether to take it seriously or not. Life always tests us with these revealing objects. Olivia, of course, couldn't grasp the depth of it. She rolled her eyes, more concerned with what the guests might think than with the weight of history that gift carried. But Catherine pressed on. "Daniel, do you understand what this key means? It's not just a piece of iron. It's the door to everything your father worked his whole life to protect. Don't laugh this off. Take it seriously." And then silence fell once again, because everyone realized this was no longer just a gift. It was a summons, as if inside that key there was a question. Do you still know who your father is? And so, in front of everyone, Daniel was left speechless, because no social mask can withstand the weight of a family truth laid bare in public. The humiliation that had once fallen on me, the forgotten father, shifted to him, not because I had plotted revenge, but because life itself has a peculiar way of giving each person exactly what they deserve. And inside that key was more than cold metal. It was the promise that truth, sooner or later, always finds its moment to surface, and that moment had just arrived. When Catherine spoke those words, declaring firmly that the key belonged to my safe, I felt time stand still. It was as if every gaze in that room turned to Daniel at once, demanding a reaction. The party, once loud with shallow laughter, sank into an awkward hush. Picture it, glasses frozen mid-air, guests holding their breath, and at the center of it all, my son, clutching a heavy key in one hand and trembling papers in the other. It was the moment when the illusion of luxury collided with the reality of family, upbringing, and the values he had abandoned. I've always believed truth carries its own force. You can try to hide it, sweep it under the rug, ignore the signs, but it always finds a way to rise. That's exactly what happened there. Catherine, with emotion in her voice, explained to everyone, "Your father didn't just put money behind that lock. He put the story of his life. Everything he earned with hard work is in that safe. Every drop of sweat, every night of sacrifice, it's all in there." Suddenly what had seemed like a joke, a worthless gift, became the revelation of an entire lifetime. And that's how life works, isn't it? How many times have we felt humiliated, betrayed, voiceless, only to discover that there's a moment prepared when everything turns around. Right there, in front of everyone, I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to defend myself. The silent revenge wasn't planned, but it unfolded naturally. Because nothing exposes more than the truth spoken by someone who has nothing to gain. Catherine had no reason to say what she said, but she had the courage to open her nephew's eyes. And in that instant, Daniel realized the game had changed. Meanwhile, Olivia tried to mask her discomfort, forcing a smile for the guests. But even she couldn't hide the tension, because no amount of luxury can cover shame when the heart is confronted. I could see it in Daniel's eyes, a mixture of wounded pride and buried emotion. He wanted to conceal it, but it was impossible. The key burned in his hands, as if it were made of fire instead of iron. How many times in life are we handed keys like that? Opportunities to change, unexpected lessons, hidden truths that force us to rethink everything. And the choice we make in those moments defines who we become. I remember when years ago I received my own key of revelation. It wasn't made of iron. It was a letter my father left before he passed. In it, he wrote, "Respect is not inherited in property, but in actions." Those words shaped who I am. And in that moment, watching Daniel, with that key in his hands, I realized life was repeating the cycle. It was as if my father, though long gone, was present in the room whispering, "Now it's your turn to learn." Because respect, dignity, and the value of family cannot be bought in parties or taught in elite schools. They are revealed only when truth comes to light, and that's exactly what happened. Daniel, unable to find words, muttered, I need to check." And every eye turned to him, waiting for some action, some explanation, anything that could make sense of the moment. But sometimes silence speaks louder than any speech. His silence was a confession that something far greater was at stake. The humiliation I had carried since the night before began to shift into freedom, not because I had won, but because the weight of truth was no longer on me. It was on him. And so, the party that had started with empty laughter ended in thick tension. I wasn't there to watch it unfold, but I could picture it as clearly as if I had been. That simple gift had become the center of everything. It was no longer an object, but a doorway into the reality Daniel had been avoiding. The key, the papers, Catherine's revelation, all of it fell into place like pieces of a puzzle no one expected. And deep down I knew the next step was inevitable. Daniel would go to the bank, and when he opened that safe, he would discover that the key unlocked not only metal and steel, but also his own conscience. The next morning, Daniel went to the bank. I wasn't by his side, but I know that place well. Heavy doors, hushed silence, watchful guards. Every step feels measured. As he walked toward the vault room, I imagined the key felt heavier than it had the day before. It wasn't just old iron in his hand. It was the memory of every time he had chosen easy shine over honest sweat. The safe, once invisible in his life, now loomed like a mirror. And mirrors, when they don't lie, have a way of scaring us. When the key turned in, the lock, the metallic click, echoed like thunder inside him. The door opened, not to bars of gold, not to stacks of cash, but to something even more unsettling. Documents, simple papers, but with a weight heavier than all the safes in the world could hold. Inside were records of years of work, the deed to a property valued at $1.2 million, receipts of debts paid off, proof of sweat transformed into dignity, and among them, letters. Letters written by my own hand, where I had recorded every sacrifice, every choice, every sleepless night. Have you noticed how handwritten words have power? A crooked letter, a smudge of ink, a heavier stroke betraying the emotion of the moment. It's nothing like a typed message. Handwriting carries soul. In those letters, I described how I had turned down promotions so I could be present in his childhood, how I held onto an old car so I could invest in his education, how I worked 3 different jobs to keep the house standing. I didn't write to boast, but to show that the foundation of any family is built quietly, with invisible bricks of love, respect, and responsibility. I can only imagine the impact as he read each word, because there's no way to laugh at a truth written with tears. That safe didn't just hold assets, it held memory, it held emotion, and every letter was like a key within the key, opening doors he had never allowed himself to walk through. Haven't we all had revelations like that? Maybe it's an old photo stumbled upon by chance, a hidden diary from a grandfather, or some forgotten object in the back of a drawer. These encounters with the past have the power to strip away our pride and remind us where we came from. Among the most valuable documents was the deed to the property. It wasn't just a dollar figure. It was a symbol. That land represented the sweat of a lifetime, the physical ground of all the dreams I built, and the ones I gave up so his could live. It was the result of years of sacrifice, the materialization of what many might call success, but what I call legacy. Because success without family is nothing more than vanity, and legacy without respect is nothing more than inheritance without meaning. But the most delicate part was yet to come. At the end of one of the letters, I had written a line that now felt almost prophetic. This inheritance is yours, if you never forget who stood by your side. It wasn't a legal clause, not in any contract. It was moral, written in ink and conviction. It was as if I had left there one last lesson, perhaps the most important of all. Because inheriting houses, accounts, or businesses means nothing if the heart is empty of gratitude. Without respect for family, any fortune becomes a curse. That's when Daniel felt the ground shake beneath him. Because this wasn't just a testament of wealth, it was a testament of values. He realized he wasn't looking at a weak father who could be humiliated on Christmas night, but at a man who had built with dignity and discipline, something he could never buy with parties or appearances. That safe didn't hold just riches. It held living proof that betrayal can wound, but it can never erase the truth. And truth, sooner or later, always comes to collect its due. In the last letter, among lines stained by time and by a few tears that had fallen as I wrote, I left a condition, not a legal one, but a moral covenant. The words were clear. This inheritance is yours, if you never forget who stood by your side. I didn't write it as a threat, but as a profound reminder that wealth makes no sense without memory, without respect, without gratitude. Imagine inheriting a castle and, within its walls, not recognizing the faces that laid each stone. That emptiness is heavier than poverty itself. I know many would say, but George, you should have just handed over the assets without asking for anything in return. But it wasn't about return. It was about education. Money without moral value is like water in a cracked jar. It spills out, disappears, builds nothing. How many children inherit fortunes only to destroy them within years because they never learned to value what they received? That's what I didn't want for Daniel. The condition I left was simple. Don't forget who stood by you, because forgetting is the cruelest form of betrayal. As he read those words, I imagine my son felt his throat tighten. Maybe he remembered each time he chose the company of strangers over a simple, dinner with me. Maybe he recalled how, in moments of vanity, he set aside the family that had formed him. And there, in front of the safe, what once seemed like the humiliation of a forgotten father became a silent revenge, not planned, not cruel, but inevitable. Because nothing hurts more than realizing the love that sustained your life came with the condition of being acknowledged. I've always believed the greatest lessons aren't taught through scolding, but through example. When I was young, I inherited something modest from my father, an old watch and a letter. He wrote, "Take care of time, because it's the only wealth that never returns." I never forgot those words. And see, it wasn't about the watch itself, but about the value behind it. When I left Daniel that condition, it wasn't about the $1.2 million property, nor about the papers, but about what they symbolized. Inheritance without awareness is just dead weight. Inheritance with awareness can be liberation. And life, of course, loves its paradoxes. Daniel now held in his hands what so many dream of: stability, wealth, security. And yet that very condition shook him to his core. It was as if I had placed a mirror inside the safe, forcing him to look at himself directly. What good are possessions if your soul is empty? What good are friends at glamorous parties if, on the most important night of the year, you forget the man who gave you your very first gift of life? That was the dilemma I wanted him to face. And then, the unexpected happened. In the middle of that silent reading, his phone buzzed. A simple notification, yet it carried immeasurable weight. It was a short message from me. "I hold no resentment. I am at peace. Merry Christmas, son." 7 words that dismantled his pride more than any material condition ever could. Because true forgiveness doesn't need explanation. It cuts straight through. It's like water finding the cracks in stone. In that moment, Daniel realized this wasn't about inheritance. It was about reconciliation. And so, standing before the key, the papers and the letters, he understood he had a choice to make. He could ignore the condition and go on living in appearances. Or he could accept that without respect, without family, without dignity. No wealth is worth it. That was the real surprise. The condition wasn't a burden. It was a chance, an opportunity to return to the path he had abandoned. And as he read my words, with the phone still trembling in his hands, the next step became clear: to find me. Because some messages don't call for written replies. They demand presence. When Daniel read my text, "I hold no resentment. I am at peace. Merry Christmas, son," the weight on his shoulders seemed to collapse all at once. There was no accusation, no bitterness, only silence translated into forgiveness. And isn't it remarkable how forgiveness, when it's genuine, has the power to disarm even the hardest of hearts? It doesn't need long speeches or complicated justifications. A single simple phrase is enough to awaken a conscience. There, in front of that glowing screen, my son finally understood this wasn't about money or conditions, but about something infinitely greater: the chance to begin again. I wasn't with him in that moment, but I can picture it. Daniel, eyes welling with tears, looking around and realizing that none of the luxury gifts, none of the company that surrounded him, could offer the peace those 7 words brought. How many times does life remind us of this? We chase recognition, parties, status, and forget that real comfort lies in invisible gestures, in words spoken with love, in silent embraces that need no explanation. That's why I always say, there's a kind of wealth that can't be measured in dollars, but in the tears that cleanse the heart. That was when he made the decision that would change the course of our story. He left everything behind that night: the glasses of champagne, the forced laughter, the appearances. He ran like someone who had finally understood that dignity and respect aren't found on glittering stages, but in simple homes. The road to my house might have seemed short, but for him, it was the longest journey of his life, because it wasn't just measured in miles. It was a journey inward, a return to forgotten values, a painful dive into his own conscience. Meanwhile, I sat in my living room. The Christmas lights still glowed on the tree. The candles had melted low, and I, alone, reflected on the weight of everything that had happened. I wasn't expecting anything more. My message hadn't been sent to spark repentance. It was to free myself. Because when you forgive truly, you don't do it hoping for change in the other. You do it so you don't live imprisoned by bitterness inside yourself. Betrayal, humiliation, pain, all of it loses its strength when you choose the path of liberation. And it is that choice that restores peace, even if no apology ever comes. Suddenly I heard hurried footsteps outside. The door was ajar, as if it had been waiting. Daniel stepped in without knocking, like someone afraid that if he hesitated, his courage would vanish. What he saw was simple: me, sitting in an armchair, head resting, holding an old family photo in my hands. No music, no feast, no celebration, just the silence of the house and the blinking lights, witnesses to a night that refused to end. And that's when he broke. The tears he had held back in front of others fell freely. How many times in life have we done the same? Holding our composure, hiding pain behind masks, only to find the courage to be real in silence. That's what happened to Daniel. He fell to his knees before me, clutching my hands like a man hanging onto his last lifeline. He didn't say much. Sometimes words are too small for the weight of true regret. He whispered only, "Dad, forgive me. I don't want to lose you anymore. I don't want to live away from what truly matters." And in that moment, I didn't just see the man he had become. I saw the little boy who once ran to me, holding my hand before Christmas dinner. And so, in that unexpected reunion, I realized life had closed another cycle. The silence in my house wasn't the same anymore. It was no longer the silence of betrayal, but the calm of reconciliation. And even though not everything was solved, that moment was a first step, a sign that rebuilding was possible. But I knew true transformation wouldn't be in the apology itself, but in what came after. Because that night's embrace would only be the beginning of a larger journey toward complete reconciliation. When Daniel walked into the room and found me asleep in the armchair, still holding that old family photo, time seemed to dissolve. There was no wealth, no safe, no $1,000,000 inheritance, just a weary father, scarred by humiliation, but still willing to love. He approached slowly, as if afraid to break something fragile, and when his eyes landed on that photograph, me, him, and his mother, younger, smiling in a Christmas long gone, he couldn't resist. He fell to his knees and wept like a child, like someone who finally realized that betrayal and pride no longer had a place in the presence of a simple embrace, begging forgiveness. Kneeling before me, Daniel whispered words broken by sobs. "Dad, I was wrong. I never should have left you alone. I forgot what really matters." It was an apology so sincere it seemed to echo, not just in the room, but inside me as well. And you know what struck me most? It wasn't the tears. It was the humility. Because sometimes the greatest act of dignity is admitting your failure. How many of us carry resentment, unable to say, "I'm sorry"? And yet, it's that very simple act that has the power to restore broken families. Still half asleep, I opened my eyes and found him there. Broken, but true. My heart tightened, not from pain, but from the emotion of seeing the son I thought I had lost finally return. I didn't answer with speeches. I knew words weren't necessary. I placed my hand on his head, like a blessing, and let silence speak for me. Because sometimes what heals isn't what we say, but what we transmit through touch, through a look, through a gesture. Respect, when it returns, doesn't need to be declared. It simply manifests itself. As I embraced him, memories rushed back. Every night I stayed awake worrying about him. Every time I worked double shifts so he would lack nothing. I thought of the humiliations, the dismissals, the silent betrayals I had carried alone, and I realized something powerful. Every tear shed now was worth it, because they watered the seed of reconciliation. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't victory, it was liberation. The profound relief of knowing that in the end, love still had room to triumph over pride. Daniel looked me in the eyes and promised, "Dad, I'll never leave you alone again. I want to be present, not just on Christmas, but every day we still have together." It was like hearing music after a long silence, and I, with my tired wisdom, simply replied, "I don't ask for promises, son. I only ask that you live with awareness. Understand that family is not a burden, but a root. That respect is not a favor, but a duty. The rest, life will teach you." And I saw in his eyes that he understood. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to begin. In that silent embrace, which lasted longer than any words could, I realized that the true gift of that Christmas wasn't the key, nor the documents, nor even the $1.2 million property. It was right there, in the reunion of father and son, in the reconciliation that once seemed impossible, but had become real. And I understood that dignity is not something others give you. It is something you preserve within, even when you've been hurt. And in the end, the greatest inheritance one can leave doesn't fit in safes or deeds. It fits in restored hearts. And so, that night, which began in loneliness and betrayal, ended in freedom and emotion. I can't say what the future will bring, perhaps new difficulties, perhaps new challenges in our family relationship. But I learned that the path to rebuilding doesn't come with guarantees. It is built with daily choices of respect, humility, and love. And as I closed my eyes again in that armchair, still holding Daniel, I understood. The true Christmas doesn't happen when we open presents, but when we open our hearts. And in that instant, I felt that our story had only just begun. And maybe that is the great hidden lesson in all this. It isn't the luxury of parties, nor the price of gifts that defines a family, but the courage to recognize mistakes and rebuild what once seemed lost. How many times have you failed to value those who always stood by you? How many promises have you broken? Or how many times have you been hurt by the broken promise of someone else? What would you do today if you had the chance to ask for forgiveness or to offer someone a second chance? Because the truth is, no inheritance, no matter how great, can ever make up for the absence of respect. Dignity is born out of actions, and the most powerful form of revenge we can have is proving that we kept moving forward without losing who we truly are. So let me ask you, what will you choose? To keep repeating the mistakes that drive people away, or to take the first step toward reconciliation that sets you free? Think about it. And if this story touched you in any way, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, with every new story, you'll not only find emotion, you'll also find reflections that might transform the way you see life and family relationships.